Welcome to the Compliance Trestle Issue Review. Today is September 4th. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. And just a reminder that this meeting is being recorded and will be shared publicly on our YouTube channel to promote transparency and accountability. Your participation in these meetings is an agreement to abide by the OSCAL-Compass Code of Conduct, which can be found in the community repository. All right, let me go down to the bottom here for September 4th and switch to this tab where we can review some new issues. It's actually a little hard to tell which ones are new. But we can, I think we might want to start here.
Can you sort by date or number?
Yeah, let's see. Oldest.
It says newest up top.
Yeah, I believe we reviewed this last time, and given that this doesn't have any labels, I'm going to go ahead and assume that we haven't. Oh yeah, this is in the new status. Okay. Still working on that triaging issue, and then we'll be able to figure out which ones are new and which ones aren't. I hope to have that done in the next couple of weeks. But yeah, this is a new issue about the outdated demos for the demo in Compliance Trestle demos.
So is this specifically for SSP only, because some of the demos were updated by the interns? So is it only for the SSP demo or others also?
I believe this is just for the SSP author demo, but I think that might be the only thing that the user tried. Right. This did arise from a discussion, if I'm not mistaken. I'm also wondering if we should transfer this to the actual repo where it's where the issue is.
You could, but it might get lost. Who's going to look at it?
Yeah, that's fair.
Yeah. It's got Docker on the website, so
I mean, if it's broken, we should fix it or get rid of the demos. I mean, I don't know that this is pressing to fix it right now, but
why don't we label this a docs fix? I mean, the -S option, I can't remember what that's meant to do.
Mm. Okay.
I got a more meta one on documentation, so it might drive what we want to do.
Okay.
Gotcha. I'll just mark this as ready. Is this easy enough that we want to add it to the current milestone, which I believe only has one issue right now?
I'm unwilling to be. I mean, you have to assign somebody to add it to the milestone, don't you? I mean, I'm not willing to sign up for it yet until I see what else I have got on my plate.
That's fair. I think we could come back to it if the milestone doesn't look too full.
Okay.
Okay. Go back here. Okay, so this one I submitted based on a discussion coming in. Essentially, if a user tries to use the component generate from a component definition that did not originate from Trestle, meaning it has no rule properties, it will actually create Markdown, but it's unusable Markdown. So it doesn't have any of the original description information. And if you try to update the Markdown, it doesn't make any updates to the JSON. So I think there's a few different things that we could do here, but I just created the bug because at least at the base of this, it seemed like there was a bug in that it was even creating the markdown in the first place if we're not supporting component definitions that don't originate from the Trestle workflow. So I just kind of wanted to put that up for discussion.
So just to understand, so normally the flow is we have a CSV file. From there we generate the component definition JSON, and then using the generate command we generate the markdown. So what you're saying is if we directly have the JSON file and run the generate command, the markdowns are not correct.
Right. Yes.
So did you check like what are the differences compared to when we generate using the CSV file versus the JSON if you already have? Were there any specific differences because of this which is happening? Because ideally the generate command, if it is working, because generate command is working on the JSON file, right? It is not working on CSV file. So unless there are differences in way the description or other things are being captured, then then only the generate command will have two different markdowns. It will generate two different kind of markdown, one where it is correct, the other it is not correct, right?
Right. So I was able to reproduce the issue, and the difference is that if I have an existing JSON file with the descriptions filled out, the descriptions are empty. So it's almost like I have like a new component definition, maybe. The descriptions are completely empty on the generated markdown. And if I try to fill them, or if I try to, for instance, change the implementation status, nothing would change when I did the assemble. So something else I did is I went into the JSON and just created a test rule property to see if I could get things back on track, and that did work. So I created a rule property, and then it was able to generate properly and assemble back properly. But essentially, it just means that without the rules, the workflow doesn't work.
Okay, got it. Okay, so there
But
are
that
two.
seems,
Sorry, go ahead.
seems pretty brittle. I would think that we would want to support it without rules because
Yes. So
Yeah.
I believe when we introduce the rule, a bug might have been introduced that only when there is a rule, it is doing the assemble, right? If there is no rule, somehow it is skipping it. So I believe that's a bug. The second part where you have a description in the JSON, but when you generate the markdown, I believe that was intentional, that we didn't want to override the text in the markdown, right? Because markdown, the content in the markdown takes precedence, especially for the description part, right? Where we have implementation requirements, how the control is implemented and all. The markdown is the source of truth, not the JSON. But if we add it explicitly in the markdown and assemble it back, then the text should have been updated in the JSON. So that should work. So I believe because of the rules, there is a bug that without the rules, both these things are not working.
Okay. And you do agree that like if the markdown's new though, if it's brand new markdown or I use force overwrite, it should pull the descriptions from JSON though.
No. So if you don't have markdown and if you just run the generate command, I'm not sure whether the description. So markdown were existing or not. If the markdowns existed and then you run the generate command, then the description would not be overwritten in the markdown because that was by design. But
Right.
if the markdown didn't exist and it is creating the first time, now whether at that point also whether the descriptions are getting written to markdown or not, I'm not pretty sure whether that was happening earlier or not.
In this use case, it's not. And
Okay.
per the discussion, that's kind of what the user was expecting, is for the descriptions to be available in the markdown when it's initially being created.
that should be there, I would have thought.
Yeah. So if fresh markdowns are getting created, then description should get copied from the JSON. But if the markdown exists, then it will not overwrite it, because that was the design, I believe.
I honestly can't remember at this stage, so I just want to make sure it's consistent with the SSP behavior.
So we just need to determine the workflow with the SSP and make sure it's consistent.
Yeah.
All right, I will go back and clean that up later, but for now I'll add a bug. And I do think that this could be something that we look at for the milestone, the current milestone. I'm not quite sure the level of effort involved, but I do remember when I was working with the SSP and the rules piece of that, it wasn't too much work. So this is something that I'm willing to work on for the next milestone, if everyone's okay with that.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, I probably shouldn't mark it as ready. Once I figure out this part, I will mark it as ready.
Are you going to assign yourself to that, or?
Yeah, I'll assign myself.
Great.
All right. Is everyone ready to move on from this one?
Yeah.
All right. And this, Lou, I don't know that we need to discuss this, but if this is something that you want to talk through a little bit, I'll just give it a moment.
You have to remind me what this is.
I think this is the footer discussion, and I believe there's already a PR in for this.
Yeah, if it's about the footer, we don't need this. I mean, there was a separate set of things to add the footer.
Okay.
So we can just close this. I don't think it. Yeah.
All right. All right. Chris, did you want to talk through this one a little bit?
Yes, 16. Let me just open it up again on my side. Okay, so the issue I ran into was that this is like a duplication of efforts issue. So I think this is really about having a look at, there's a few places in the documentation website where there's a little bit of duplication, particularly from the README. From two places. One is from the README, which is kind of known. We can potentially abstract that out. The other one is that there's a few things which we could pull through as variables from the actual source code. So what I was thinking about doing was effectively going through and adding some macros to the documentation, so that when we have things like version numbers and OSCAL versions and other bits and pieces, that we could just globally define those in the code, and the documentation would automatically update off of the code. So it's maybe not a bug. Some stuff is wrong in the documentation, but it's just how do we minimize the effort of the documentation, the amount of documentation can drift with things like, which OSCAL version it is. I'm willing to have a go at this one, but I'm not sure whether we want to put this one into the roadmap. You'll see the bigger documentation issue I have later.
Okay. Here, we can come back to this one after reviewing the other one then and decide.
Yeah.
But yeah, I believe this is good, right? I also noticed the version numbers were not updated in the documentation. So if we can have the variables and use that everywhere in the documentation, that would keep things consistent. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a little trickier, but I found, but I think we can gonna cover off in a second.
Sounds good. All right, let's move on to, oh, and this is another like documentation website one.
Yeah, I mean, this one's pretty easy. We don't have any cookie. We got cookies for analytics, which has now been transferred to CNCF. But we don't have any kind of GDPR cookie flag on there. So I just wanted to see if we probably should have a cookie consent flag. So I just wanted to add that in. It's pretty easy to do. I just didn't know if there was any mandated text from CNCF to do that.
Not that I've seen, but I do agree that it's probably important to do either way, and would propose that, especially given that it's lower effort. We just put it in a milestone.
Yeah, I'll do it. It's like 3 lines in Markdown. So it's 3 lines in MakeDocs configuration. It's embedded into the logic of Markdown material, MakeDocs material. So it's not a big change at all.
Cool. Does anyone object to that, or is everyone okay with that going in the milestone?
Sounds great, especially if Chris volunteers.
I
Good. Yeah.
I've done it before, so it's a bit easier. Not gonna make someone learn it themselves.
All right. Oh, sorry. Is there anything else on this one?
No. I was just thinking about the next one.
All right. And yep, this one. Okay.
Okay. This is more of an epic, so it doesn't really go in the documentation. I think this is more for us to debate what we wanted to do. So I spent quite a bit of time fiddling with the documentation. There's a big, not a huge PR, but a decent sized PR to improve, to validate website links every time we do a build, so we can't have dead links running out of our website, which I think is a good practice to make sure that we don't end up getting, because dead links decreases your Google search score as well. So what I was thinking of was basically a list of things which I've done before with these websites, or think that we might want to do that would be interesting. The big one on my list right now, because it has a little bit of a pain, is right now when we first generated this website, there were some constraints which meant that we manually built a navigation tree. Most times when you use MakeDocs, you don't do that. You infer it from the directory tree. And when you need to do overrides, you can use this component, which means you just have to do overrides for the website, or this is the page in the website that you need. So if you need to insert an external link, you just really have to insert the external link and do that once. So that was like the number one. Number two was refining the API docs. I know that I talked about it in an early discussion that it was becoming a bit of a pain. I managed to work my way around that. I'm not convinced that they're all entirely useful. We might want to think about whether we need to look at ways of improving the metadata around it, so it's not just very raw API docs, particularly for effectively the API spec. It's a bit hard to read, so we might want to have a look at how we improve it. The HTML tags can be a little bit tricky to deal with.
Before you move on from the API docs,
Yeah.
How is API actually defined? Is in Trestle, is it just everything that's public is part of the API, or how do we limit what the
Yeah.
Because to my way of thinking, that if it's everything, that seems really bad. I think we should constrain what is available as part of the official API. because some of the things that are public may not really be part of the API, even though they may be claimed to be. I'm not sure about that, but.
Yeah, that's a good point. At the moment, the API docs are everything.
Yeah,
Which
and
is probably
it's
not
not clear
ideal.
how careful, it's not clear how careful the code is about marking things that are private versus public. And, you know, you could get yourself into trouble about changing internal things and people are dependent upon it. And that's a whole bad thing to get started on. So I know that's a little bit tangential, but
no, it's a good point. I think it does go to one of Jen's updates in the community pieces as well. I think that's definitely something to think about whether we want to that, but that's probably in the that was kind of where I was when I said remove, because like how useful is this? It's internal. Some of these things are internal. It's not quite as useful as you need. But refining the API docs or subsetting it might be something that we need to do, but that would be in the context of a broader kind of stated change in terms of how we're managing versioning.
okay.
Yeah, I just wanted to mention that I have a proposal in the community repo to kind of create a more well-defined SDK that we can document and kind of make those boundaries a little bit more clear. And I've marked everyone here as a reviewer. So if you want to take a look, I'm definitely open for feedback there. But yes, that's a little off topic.
Yeah, Jen, we can discuss that because I believe since Chris is here, right, we can discuss that. You're talking of the architecture where we break the Trestle into SDK and the upper part, right? That's what you're mentioning.
Yes, I am.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So let's discuss that because I was not very clear on the need for that, and we have to see how tightly coupled the two pieces are, and whether the individual piece, the lower piece, is by itself has much use or usable, right, without the top piece, right? So we'll have to debate those aspects before we take a call.
Yeah, 100%. Maybe we can go through this, but I just wanted to kind of, maybe we don't even have to read through all of these, but effectively, maybe pulling out to the idea was here are a set of enhancements which I think we can do progressively. Each of them are not huge issues. A lot of them, like the automated spell checking, is actually, well, that will be a pain because once you introduce it, you have to make it comply the first time. So that's probably quite a bit. That's probably the biggest one in there. But a lot of it's really kind of they're in. I want to spin these out as individual issues, unless there's any which people really object to. The one which is probably a little bit different is number 8. Number 8 was, can we build a single website which rolls up nicely for the entire of OSCAL-Compass org? The challenge is if we do that, then we basically mandate how documentation is done for the entire entire project. So if we do 8, I think it has to be a community reviewed activity as well. But I just wanted to kind of progressively clean things up so it's as nice as possible. There's not much kind of cruft in there, which is kind of abstracted out, and it generates the best possible content for things like if you want to put a link on LinkedIn. So we can do it where every website has its own preview as well, and it does image generation, all these kind of fun little bits and pieces, which I've done before with Make Docs. Any thoughts?
So
I would prefer keeping. Sorry.
Go ahead.
No, so I was saying that I would prefer keeping the documentation for different projects separate. Each project have their own evolution and all, and just mandating every project to do same way might be a bit difficult on the maintenance aspect specifically, right?
Well, I think 8. I think that was the point. I think 8, we might want to segregate that one out, and I'm happy if we annotate this issue with 2 and 8 on these items need to be removed and considered separately. And explicitly, I think we need to consider 8 as a community activity. The other ones I can just generate issues for and link this and basically make this an epic and then close it one. Or we can, basically, use it as an epic.
And also, I believe there was a discussion on maintaining multiple versions of the documentation, right, for different releases of Trestle, especially the major.
That one it can also be done. I would like to get some of this stuff done first, because one of them is like effectively markdown minimization and a few other bits and pieces, so we don't end up with too much garbage before we do that.
Okay. So we can capture that here, but yeah, that can be done as the last thing, right? Because that would require a lot of changes, I believe.
Yeah, I think all these things are great. I think number 8 is ambitious, but it would be nice to have some semblance of uniformity across the suite of projects that are called OSCAL-Compass.
Yeah, so there is actually a tooling layer where you can do roll-ups. So each project could be rendered as its own website, or it can be rolled up into one website. But it gets a little it means that you have to have all this stuff organized. You have to be really consistent, or you get yourself in trouble. So the idea was just roll through, get as much of the consistency as we can, and then we can use that to kind of roll up and figure everything else out as we go. Technically, it doesn't actually need to change. Like, the URL probably won't change for the compliance Trestle stuff at all. Effectively, it'd just be coming from one root repository, which is a little bit strange way to think of it, but it does work. It means you can just keep on going all the way up when you go to the website.
So it looks like this is pretty much a broken down epic. So what we could do is tag it as an epic and just add it to the current cycle, and then create like a task list or like sub issues. Does that work?
Yeah. Yeah, that was kind of what I was getting at, was like, are people happy for me to go in and like, I'm happy to go and kind of hack at this with a bit of time on weekends, just to kind of churn on it, because each of these things is kind of small. It just needs to be, we just need consensus that we're going to spend a little bit of time on it, because it'll chew up in a bit of a review cycle as well.
Yeah, that sounds good to me, modulo the API discussion.
Yeah, I think we can pull that one out.
Yep, I'm good with it. -2 and 8 as well.
Yes, same here.
All right. If we're ready to move on, I think that's the end of the new issues. We could either discuss the current milestone, or if you guys prefer, we could talk a bit about the proposal.
Maybe we can discuss the proposal. Yeah.
Okay.
Could
We
we,
have
I'm sorry,
all
could we
these
just, could we just look at the milestones, what's in there so far?
Sure.
There was just one, did you say? Or?
Yeah, starting out, yeah, it was just one, because we did complete a lot of issues on 3, 4,
Okay,
0.
so we don't have to do this now, but we're looking for candidates for the milestone?
Yes, we're looking for feature candidates for the milestone. Or bugs, yeah. All right, here, I'll go here. And then, yes, we can look at this real quick. Actually review it from here because it's just easier. So, because I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about what you brought up, the usability of the bottom without the top.
Okay, so can you just go to the diagram? So maybe we can use it.
The one that Yana had posted.
Yeah, so we understand, right?
Yeah.
Okay. So currently we have the top one, right, where all the 2 two pieces, the Trestle base and the repository and CLIs are into one project. And I believe the proposal is to split that into two separate projects. One is just the Trestle base, which has the core OSCAL models and the adapter API layer to manipulate those models through the, whether we call it API or directly the OSCAL classes and all, right? And then we have on top of it the other CLIs and tasks and transformers and all those things. So is this the proposal, if I understand correctly, Jen?
It is. I think the diagram I created was a little bit more granular than this because I wasn't exactly sure what goes into the OSCAL adapter, but I did agree that if we wanted to, in the API, have the OSCAL classes, anything that's useful for manipulating those classes, things like maybe the resolver, things that are part of OSCAL and not very Trestle specific might be an idea. But the main part of the proposal is let's split them up and decide what would be useful to go into the SDK and what would be useful not to go into the SDK. So as far as where the split is, I'm open there, but I'll just show.
But what's the main motivation for splitting this up?
So there's a couple things that I could just talk about from my experience using the SDK. For one, it's not very clear what's supported as part of the SDK or what the SDK is and what the Trestle CLI is. Using the repository API is a little bit difficult because as an API, because it's exiting, so I have to catch the exit code and I don't have really any information around the error, so error handling is a little bit clunky. The other thing is that the API, when we make changes to the CLI, tends to break. There's breaking changes to the API and we're not versioning it that way. So versioning, there tends to be a versioning mismatch. And then finally, there's been issues where we're pinning dependencies in the CLI, and then I, as an API user, can't update. So I think with the API, we could make the dependencies like have a range or be a bit looser there versus the CLI, where we would want that to be like very reproducible and deterministic. So that's just a few things, but
Are you specifically talking of the repository API class and the functions it has?
Yeah, that's one of them, but the others are, I think it still stands for like the other pieces. Not the OSCAL classes. I understand that every time we update the OSCAL classes, that usually means we're going to do a major version bump, but the pieces around that, I don't believe that we're doing a major version bump when there's breaking changes to those, but if you have a different perspective, I'm also open to hearing that as well.
So as far as I remember, right, if the adapter has some common utility classes, right? We have control reader, writer. There are some other utility functions that are there. That's part of the adapter, which is getting used at all the places in the code. The repository API and CLIs are on top of that. So Trestle enforces an opinionated way of doing things, right? So it has a specific directory structure where we can import the files, manipulate them, and so on, right? So that's the part which is there in the CLI. And the repository API specifically, we're just trying to mirror the CLI so that if somebody wants to use it programmatically, then we can just use the API rather than using the CLI. Now, how good the SDK is, because I'm not sure we have very detailed APIs created for all the models. So, and this can add here, right? We generate the classes, and after that, I believe there are only few classes which like control reader, writer, and maybe some utility classes which are there on top of it, but not for all the models. We don't have a kind of an API class which is used to manipulate that model, because one can directly go ahead and use the, say, an assessment result class to either create an assessment result or edit it and update and so on, if they really want to do it. But we don't have a specific API created for all those additional models here.
Right. But we wouldn't really have an opportunity to either have anyone contribute to that, because I mean, just coming from kind of newer on the project, it's a little bit daunting to get used to the code, and there's a lot of code in core, and it's a little bit difficult to understand where to put certain things. Like, I actually wasn't aware that the control reader and writer was part of the OSCAL adapter, so that's cool. I learned that today. But I think I'm just suggesting we take maybe certain pieces, like we do have the catalog API, so that is something that could perhaps go in the SDK, and just start making a place for these types of reusable functions to go, is more my suggestion. What I marked as out of scope here is I wasn't suggesting we change or add features to the SDK that don't exist in Trestle now, or like very much change the architecture. Just find a natural way to split it that would make the SDK useful without adding way too much into the SDK, essentially.
I think we might have to, I think back to the point that Lou had before. I think it makes sense to carve some of this out, because it does give us this concept of a cleaner API contract. And then there's a whole lot of all the command line goop, all the things that we do internally can be kind of effectively, we can class things out into two levels. Then we basically have stuff which is where the contract we have for the API is the CLI. Is in the Trestle component, so that's the principal API contract that we're trying, and the outcomes, but it's at the API command layer. So it's at the CLI command level is what Trestle is basically putting a guarantee around versioning, and we just make everything else inside of it. We can say is just we can manipulate it, which will give us more room to maneuver and experiment and optimize things as we move forward. And then if we take the bare minimum, and I'm not saying the bare minimum is cleanly defined here yet, I think there's probably plenty of arguments to be had over that, would be moved into the base. And maybe we start with, so the way Python works, technically, from a user perspective, a user could not change anything except for the package that they're downloading with pip, and we could keep the code running as it is today. I think what we'd find is we'd want to start manipulating things to kind of build a cleaner barrier between the various components. Because I think if we look at this and we decide what we want to go in and out, we're probably going to want to reorganize the code a bit. Not in terms of how the code functions, but in terms of just naming.
So I think I agree with I think everybody's in agreement that there should be some small set of methods that are identified as the official SDK, and there's no real code changing going on, or minimal code changing going on to make that happen, right? And we say that that's the SDK, and we can expand or contract that in the future, but that would be a major breaking change kind of a thing. The contraction part anyway. But is that essentially what you're saying here in this proposal, Jen? Is that you're just going to identify the things that we think are part of the SDK and call them as such?
Exactly. Yep.
So I'm in favor. I vote yes.
Okay, so let me understand. So what you're trying to say is we clearly define what goes into SDK and what goes into the CLI and repository API, right? Even without splitting, right? So that we have a clear boundary between these two pieces. Is that the idea?
Yeah,
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 I think. Yeah, I think the idea is to start. So I think we need to start with that, like to define. And then we need to I think the idea is we can pull it. We should pull it out into a separate project so that we can version change it independently of what we do with the CLI. And that will mean that if you're building an API like a bot or a or or a REST API, then you'll be able to track the version changes without having whatever we do in the CLI affecting what they're doing.
yeah, you're right, Chris. That is part of the proposal. So I'm proposing it be at least a separate Python package, separate dependencies, separated out dependencies, versioning completely different from the CLI. That's part of it as well.
Yeah,
See,
and again,
keeping the package separate might involve too much. Then we have to maintain two separate projects, and the CLI project would anyway be very tightly coupled with the SDK project, right? Because if we update the SDK, right, CLI would need to be updated. For example, if we update the OSCAL version, CLI would need to be updated to match with the SDK. So CLI would always go hand in hand with the SDK. Correct?
There's no doubt the CLI is built on top of the SDK, and it will have to move. I think the issue is less for the people who are developing the CLI here. It's more for people who are using the Python classes that we have, because at the moment we can't provide a clean API contract between what we're doing, which means that if we have, it's going to be very hard for us to provide any kind of enduring support for the SDK today, because backing out changes involve backing out changes in the CLI as well. But I think now we have an org kind of team going. It's not super hard to do this. It's what the biggest issue is going to be separating it and then making the decision that when we've kind of identified the ideal separation, whether we think that we can put a clean boundary in it or whether we're going to need to reorganize the code. If we reorganize the code, that's going to be involved like splitting out tests and all sorts of pieces to make it work nicely. So getting getting that list broken down is going to be the hardest piece of this.
does it really need to be two separate projects, or can it just be two separate?
Can you define projects first?
Of the same repo, right? It's not going to be two separate repos, is it? I mean,
I would. I'm not sure what your opinion is, Jen, but I would strongly discourage us from doing a monorepo.
I also would vote against a monorepo. If everyone else is for a monorepo, I mean, my opinion's not strong enough that I would like hold this up or anything, but I do think it might make the compliance Trestle repository difficult to read, difficult to maintain.
so the proposal then is to essentially make the current Trestle the SDK and build another repo that's going to be called CLI that depends on it.
No, I think it's the other way around.
Yeah, we would keep Trestle intact. We would just name it Compliance Trestle Python is the and yeah, so Trestle should not change.
Yes. So just to be kind of contextual for this, if we think about how it is, let's just say today we only export compliance like Trestle to OSCAL into compliance Trestle Python. It's completely possible that we can do that. And from an end user who is importing compliance Trestle, they would not know. which is the kind of slightly mind-bending part around Python. So you can kind of clean it out.
Okay, so
by-
you're saying the same thing, but you're just doing it in a different way. And you're saying that the current Trestle is going to be the CLI, and you're going to extract out the SDK and move it.
Yeah.
And nobody will know the difference. I understand.
Well, I think
I get it.
at some point people will know the difference because we'll have to make some changes, but for parts of it they won't know. I think the other one is it's going to be a lot friendlier for them if the compliance Trestle CLI will import the SDK. So as we kind of pull it out, it's going to be a cleaner journey for people who might not be paying as much attention if we do it that way. The other reason why to do it that way is because we could pull the APIs out, and then we can do a cutover to flip it to the upstream, so to the new API package over time. If we do it in the main repo and create a CLI separately, it's going to create all sorts of mess.
Yeah, no, your reason is, I got it. I understand. Sounds good to me.
It's a pile of work.
No, I agree, but I think at the end of the day, I think it's to be able to say that we have this well-defined SDK that is that works for me. I like that.
So the purpose of the SDK would be just the manipulation of the OSCAL objects in Python classes, right? That's all, correct?
Yeah, so I
the
think
given API structure, right?
the SDK would have no main, let's put it that way. So you would have to call it by doing an import of the class itself.
But there will be an API contract, right? So that people just use those functions and not any, because currently if you look, right, every time we update catalogs and all to new versions of OSCAL, there'll be new functions getting added here and there, right? We want the API functions to be fixed, right? Or at least same, right?
Well, I think there's a reality that when OSCAL changed their spec, it has OSCAL changing their spec is always at least a major change for us.
Right.
Even if they've got a minor change, it's a major change. It creates net new features for us. So as a result, I think the thing here is we can be a little bit more gated in terms of how we do the changes for that as well, because we'll be able to trace it a little bit more closely.
With the 10 minutes we have left, is everyone all right if we continue this maybe in Slack or on the issue itself and take a look at the upcoming milestones so we can add a few, so we can fill that out a bit more?
The only comment, which just to make sure everyone caught it, there is a proposal which I've started working on. It's a little bigger because it's got detail on kind of streamlining the Git. It's in a bit of a mess still because I've got stuff which I haven't committed from when I was on a plane. Was basically trying to streamline some of the release management and do things like make it a bit more loosely coupled so we don't have to force a version update to when we have a pipeline failure, which I know has been an issue in the past. I wanted to use that to test that with the API effectively. So if we go and do this API separation, we use that to implement like a much cleaner version of the pipeline, and then we can hopefully make that reusable as much as possible, and then use it for the CLI as well. Because while the API is starting to move, in the 0 point something stage, we can go and mess with all that stuff without too much of a concern. But if we do it in the Trestle project, the core compliance Trestle project today, doing a rebuild of all of the CI processes is a complete mess, because you're guaranteed to ink out a few versions which you don't want to deal with. But I will complete this probably in the next week or so, and then get it out the door for people to have a look at.
Sounds good. Right, I'll flip over here to 350, and then I figured we could just take a look. So we have 3 issues now. I think I'm not, Alejandra, I don't know if we had come to a conclusion on what we should do here on this one, or if we should keep this in the milestone.
Yeah, well, I think not really. What I was trying to do in the meantime was to test out what you have recommended, which was a GitHub action code release, please. And as well, seeing if I could fork the original report and propose something to be fixed. But the problem is that we are going to be tied to whether they make a release soon of that or not, or well, not necessarily, but I think we didn't reach to a conclusion. But that is what I was doing in the meantime.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. So based on your proposal that you just talked about, Chris, maybe should this be moved back? Should we try to implement, if we move to release, please, it seems like it would be possibly a larger change. So I was wondering, should we look at that for the new workflows and just continue on here, possibly remove this from the milestone? Does anyone think, or Alejandra, did you feel like this is something that could be completed this milestone, or maybe we should push it back a little bit?
Yeah, I think at least we should give it a thought for discussion, right? Because it might be a big one if we are going to change it in the end. But I to be honest, I haven't gone too far yet into it, so I would like.
Why don't we?
Sorry.
Why don't we just rescope it for now to be? So there's 2 issues. One is the historical. So there's 2 issues. One is the historical changes which have got polluted, and the other one is the future changes.
Mm-hmm.
So I think one of the issues that were I think I commented on when we first had this was we can just make this a configuration change now, for which basically the issue that we have is that when people don't clean up the squash commit, and that what happened by default historically was the squash commit included the details of all the commits, and that is getting passed by Python semantic release, which was not the behavior we intended. But for the future, we can just fix the future releases, which is we will make it so that when you do a squash commit, it doesn't take that message across, which I think is a configuration for the GitHub repo. And then we could wait and we could kind of put the rest of the scope back into when we rebuild the pipelines. And that will buy us a little bit of time. Python semantic release will either change the behavior to what we want, or we use release place or something similar. Because I think this one is another one of those ones where it's like, I understand that it's got a little bit of, like, it looks a bit messy at the moment, but fixing it is a whole pile of work, which is not necessarily something we want to be doing right now if we're going to do some re-engineering of the pipelines.
That's fair. Yeah, sounds fair. to me.
I'm not sure what other people's thoughts are, but
Yeah, I'm good with removing this from the milestone if that's what we're all in agreement to do.
Okay, sure.
Okay. I'll just put it in the backlog. And then I can come back and I'll link it to that proposal just so we know why we did this. And then we have that convenient recording if I forget. Okay. I know we only have a few minutes left, so I'm just going to show the enhancements we have in the backlog. If you all would prefer, we could do this async. If you want to just take a look at the enhancements and see which ones are doable. I don't know that they have a particular priority set to them. So it might just be which ones are ready and which ones we want to take on. But I'll just pause for now. If there's anything you guys see that should be worked on in short order.
1645 I'm doing, so that one you can put into the milestone. Or I've done.
Cool.
Listed.
Sounds good.
There's actually a PR for that one up there right now.
Even better. So 1539 is part of that larger epic we discussed that got assigned to the next cycle. So I don't know that we need to figure that one out now, but probably in the next couple months.
1496 kind of occurs to me that we should have done that a while ago.
1496. Oh, I think that might actually be done, if I'm not mistaken. Lou, didn't you complete that? I thought I had seen a transition graphic.
I don't know that that's really done. I think it's ill-defined as what needs to be done to make this checkable as being done.
Okay.
I mean, there is some, there was a video from Frank about how to do this, but I don't think it's really written down anywhere other than a video. And so
we could just embed the video on the website.
yeah, it's kind of cheating, but yeah, we could do that, and it's still not 100% complete. Let's say. I mean, it's good, but it's not everything.
So milestone. It seems like we could get this.
Maybe it's ambitious to add it to the milestone right now. When is the milestone due?
A month from now.
Let's talk about it. When we have a meeting in 2 weeks.
Yes, we do.
Let's talk about it next time. Is that okay?
Yeah, that's fine. We're at the end, so I will just send out the list over Slack so we could look at a few more, but I think at least we have some things to tackle so far. So we might be able to discuss a bit more at the next issue review as well.
Okay. Can I just raise a question maybe for this next time, which is figuring out at the moment, Dependabot's kind of in full flight adding PRs.
Yeah.
We might just want to figure out what our strategy is for those to get them cleaned out as well, because I can't remember if it's doing critical security fixes or if it's just doing nice to have upgrades.
I think it's doing both, so we might need to reduce that, and the frequency is weekly right now. It's supposed to be assigning the compliance Trestle maintainers team, but we haven't kind of figured out the GitHub team situation yet. So it just basically errors and sends a comment saying the GitHub team isn't part of the repo. So that's kind of still in flight. So I essentially have been manually I'm sure you and Alejandra saw, I just been adding us like every time I see it. So there's also another problem where it's not, the title's not conventional commit compliant.
Yeah. Maybe it's something for another discussion another time. But yeah, I just was like, I don't know. It's more just, I've just been out of the loop a little bit in terms of what's our approach with these and who would be happy to commit it, or do we just let these ones go automatically through as soon as it's two people, just push the magic button? That was the other piece I was just kind of thinking about, just to make sure they get flushed out, because most of them are so minor. If it's a security one, and it needs to be done, we should just push it straight away. Was the thought I had.
Yeah,
Anyway.
I definitely think we need some sort of process, like what do we need to push these through? Because usually it's just the one person looks at it. So yeah. I agree. All right. I'll add that to next issue review. Maybe I'll do the next 8 o'clock or Eastern time one. So Chris, you might be able to make that one since it's the earlier one. Or we can do that async, but thank you everyone for joining, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks.
Thank
See
you.
you.
See you.